Work, the place we spend most of our waking hours, predictable until it's not. What if your job wasn't just about productivity, but the stage for something sinister? These are tales of ordinary jobs turned horrifying. Truckers on endless highways, divers in dark depths, coroners working late. Shadows blur reality and nightmare, where the mundane hides the macabre. Clock in, if you dare.
It started like any other day. My crew and I were working deep in the Tillamook State Forest, Oregon, far beyond the usual logging zones. This wasn't just a remote stretch of woods. It was ancient, untouched. The trees felt alive, towering above us with twisted, gnarled branches. The air was cold and heavy, even though it was midsummer. It clung to us, making the forest feel more like a cathedral than a workplace. We'd spent hours driving down forgotten dirt roads to get here. By the time we arrived, the isolation was palpable. The usual noises of the forest, bird calls, rustling leaves, seemed faint, muffled, like they were happening somewhere far away. No one said it out loud, but we all felt it. This place didn't want us here. Around midday, the foreman split us into pairs to cover more ground. My partner Joe and I headed toward the western edge of the site, where we'd seen a cluster of older trees during our survey. After about half an hour, we stumbled into a clearing. It was perfectly circular, ringed by ancient stumps and fallen logs. At its center stood a single tree, massive, towering, and unlike anything I'd ever seen. The trunk was wider than any I'd encountered in 2 decades of logging, its bark a dark, almost black gray. The tree stood alone, untouched, as though it had defied every storm and axe that had passed through these woods. The light seemed different around it, dimmer, colder. The tree dominated the space, like it had been there since the forest began. Joe stopped a few steps into the clearing, staring at it. "We shouldn't touch this one," he muttered. I glanced at him, confused. "What are you talking about? This thing's a gold mine. Look at the size of it." Joe shook his head, stepping back toward the tree line. "You don't touch trees like this. Not ones like this. Some things you leave alone." I laughed nervously, though his unease was contagious. "Come on, Joe, it's a tree, not a ghost. We're here to cut, not spook ourselves." Joe didn't answer. He crossed his arms and stayed put. I sighed, grabbed my axe, and approached the trunk. "Fine, you stay there. But this one's too good to leave standing." The first swing landed perfectly, the blade biting deep into the bark with a satisfying thwack. But the moment the axe struck, the air around us changed. It grew heavier, colder, like a storm was about to break overhead. Then came the sound, a scream. It wasn't an animal or a person. It was something else entirely. High-pitched, piercing, and so loud it felt like it was coming from inside my skull. Joe swore loudly, spinning in place to find the source. I froze, my hands still gripping the axe. "What the hell was that?" he hissed. My eyes dropped to the tree. The cut I'd made wasn't oozing sap. It was leaking something darker, thicker. It ran down the trunk in slow, glistening streams. Blood, or something that looked too close to blood for comfort. A sharp, metallic stench filled the air, mixed with something rotten. I stumbled back, my heart racing. "Joe," I whispered, my voice trembling. "Do you see this?" "I see it," he muttered, already stepping away. "I told you to leave it alone." Before I could respond, the forest around us fell silent. Not just quiet, silent. The absence of sound was so complete it pressed against my ears like I'd gone deaf. Then the shadows at the edge of the clearing began to move. At first I thought it was just the wind shifting the light. But no, they weren't shadows. They were figures. They emerged slowly, tall and thin, with limbs that seemed too long and hollow, empty eyes that drank in the dim light around them. They didn't walk. They glided, their movements deliberate and unnatural. My breath caught in my throat as they surrounded us. Then came the voice, or voices. It wasn't one, but many, overlapping in a strange, discordant harmony. "Leave," they whispered. The sound didn't come from their mouths. It came from the air itself, echoing in my mind as much as my ears. It wasn't a suggestion. It was a command. I didn't need to be told twice. I turned and ran. leaving my axe buried in the tree. Joe was right behind me, muttering prayers under his breath as we sprinted through the woods. The silence followed us, heavy and oppressive, broken only by the sound of our boots pounding against the earth. When we reached the trucks, neither of us spoke. We didn't need to. The next morning, I convinced a few of the crew to come back with me. I don't know why. Maybe I needed proof, or maybe I just wanted to believe it had all been in my head. But when we got to the clearing, the tree was gone. Not cut down, not burned, gone. The ground where it had stood was bare, as if nothing had ever been there. But my axe was still there, lying on the dirt, the blade coated in dried, dark stains. No one could explain it. I didn't try. I quit that week, packed my things, and left the logging business for good. Driving long haul isn't just a job. It's a lifestyle. You get used to the solitude. A lot of people can't hack it, sitting behind the wheel for hours, days, sometimes even weeks, without much company except for the road and the hum of the engine. But not me. I've always liked the quiet. The only thing that really bugged me was when I'd start talking to myself, but even that didn't bother me much. It wasn't until that night that I realized the quiet had its own kind of weirdness. I was hauling a shipment of auto parts through Nevada. The stretch of highway I was on felt like it went on forever. Just a straight, empty road cutting through the desert. No signs of life for miles. I'd been driving for what felt like forever. It was just me, my rig, and the occasional tumbleweed blowing across the road. The only sound was the low hum of the tires on the pavement. It was a little after midnight, and I was running on nothing but caffeine and muscle memory. I'd been staring at that damn GPS screen for so long, I was starting to wonder if it was going to glitch out and tell me to drive off a cliff. But then, through the haze of tiredness, I saw something up ahead. A light, a gas station of all things. Out here? I rubbed my eyes to make sure I wasn't seeing things. The station was old, like it hadn't been renovated since the 80s. The neon sign flickered, and there was only one gas pump under a cracked awning. In this stretch of nowhere, I thought I was losing it. I pulled in. I needed coffee, something strong to keep me awake. I'd been driving for hours, and I was starting to feel like I could fall asleep at the wheel. Maybe this was my mind playing tricks, but I wasn't going to pass up a coffee stop. When I walked in, the place was dusty, with that stale, closed-off smell you only get from places that haven't seen a customer in years. The clerk didn't even look up from behind the counter. He was an older guy, his face lined with age, eyes half-lidded, like he hadn't slept in decades. I could have sworn he was about to fall over and nap right there on the spot. I grabbed a cup of coffee, paid in cash, figured I wasn't going to risk my card information with a place like this, and got back in my truck. I'm halfway down the road when I see it again. The same gas station, same flickering neon sign, same cracked awning. Now I'm starting to question my sanity. I pulled over, checked my GPS, same straight route, no turns, no loops. It was like the station had just magically appeared. I'm no expert on things like this, but I figured it had to be a trick of the light or something. I told myself, okay, it's a desert mirage. People have seen worse. It's just a weird coincidence. So I kept going. But then, yep, you guessed it, I saw it a third time. Same gas station, same flickering neon. I was definitely not imagining this now. That was it. I slammed on the brakes, pulled over, and stopped at the station again. This time the same guy was standing behind the counter, not doing anything, just staring at me. Same half-lidded eyes. I froze for a second, and then it hit me. This guy was exactly the same. Same look, same tired face, same unblinking stare. I'm standing there, coffee cup in hand, and I couldn't help myself. What the hell is going on here? I asked, a little more firmly than I meant to. He didn't answer, didn't even blink. I took a step back, then another. I'm backing out of the store now, my brain trying to piece together what was happening. My first instinct was to get the hell out of there. I jumped into the truck, floored it, and hit the gas. I wasn't going to stop, not for anything, not with, whatever the hell that was going on behind me. But the thing is, the highway was still stretching out in front of me, too straight, too endless. The moon was hanging in the same spot in the sky. It didn't feel right. I glanced at the clock. No tick. The damn thing wasn't moving. I looked in my rearview mirror. Nothing. Just the same road behind me. No signs of anything. Then the radio crackled. Just static at first, but then a whisper, like it was coming from somewhere deep in the desert itself. Turn back. I slammed on the brakes. My hands were shaking. I looked around. The desert, gone. It was like the world had folded in on itself, and I was driving through an endless void. My heart was hammering in my chest, and my brain was trying to find some kind of logic in all this. But there was none. Then, there it was again. The gas station. Same cracked awning. Same flickering sign. The whole thing. I didn't even hesitate. I turned the truck around, heading back toward it. My foot was heavy on the gas pedal, my mind racing. I didn't want to stop, but I had no choice. Weeks later, when they found my truck, it was parked neatly at the station. The keys were still in the ignition, but I was nowhere to be found. I'm not sure what happened that night. Maybe I've lost my mind. Either way, I am done with Nevada. I've been a commercial diver for nearly a decade, and I've seen things most people can't imagine. The ocean is vast, mysterious, and often terrifying. I've encountered sharks, tangled wrecks, and currents strong enough to crush you against steel. But nothing compares to what happened off the coast of Nova Scotia. The job seems simple. Inspect a freighter wreck about 200 feet down to assess its potential for salvage. It seemed routine, but the water was colder than usual, even for the North Atlantic. The surface crew joked about ghosts of the deep, but I didn't take that seriously. Superstitions don't pay the bills. I descended, and everything seemed normal at first. The sunlight faded, replaced by the faint glow of my dive lights. The wreck loomed ahead, massive, rusted, and overgrown with barnacles and kelp. But something caught my eye. Markings on the hull. These weren't typical ship insignias. They were intricate symbols, almost like runes, deeply carved into the metal. "Surface, you seeing this?" I radioed. The ship manifest didn't mention anything about this. There was static, followed by a garbled response. "Keep going." I shrugged off the interference and continued. The carvings grew more detailed as I swam deeper, glowing faintly in the murky water. Then the temperature dropped, sharply. My suit sensors showed a sudden plunge, colder than it should have been. My breath came quicker, but I told myself it was just the depth. I found an opening in the wreck and swam inside. The interior was eerily intact, crates stacked neatly, untouched by time. My flashlight flickered as I scanned the area, cutting through the murk. Then I saw it, a shadow darting just out of the beam's reach. "Surface, I've got movement," I said, my voice steady despite the growing unease. "Could be a large fish or something." The response came faintly. "Get out." That wasn't my crew. The voice was distorted, layered, almost inhuman. My heartbeat quickened. The flashlight flickered again, and the shadows seemed to shift, alive in a way that didn't make sense. I turned quickly, and the shadow wasn't gone. It was closer now. Its shape was humanoid, but wrong. Its limbs were too long, its movements too fluid. Its eyes glowed faintly, piercing through the darkness. I backed away, trying to stay calm. "Surface, I'm aborting. Something's down here." The shadow moved closer, and now I could see it clearly. It wasn't just humanoid. It was something else. Its skin was translucent, like it was made of the same water I was floating in. And its eyes, no, not eyes, were hollow sockets, staring straight through me. I grabbed the tether line, signaling for an ascent, but the creature darted forward, brushing my arm. My suit's temperature gauge plummeted, and I felt a cold, creeping numbness spread from my fingertips to my chest. Then the carvings on the wreck's walls began to glow, pulsing with a sickly green light. My vision blurred, and I heard whispers, no, chants, voices in a language I couldn't understand. The creature tilted its head as if listening, then reached for me again. I kicked away, slamming into the wreck's wall. My flashlight spun out of my hand and disappeared into the void. The only light now came from the glowing carvings, flashing faster and faster in sync with my racing heartbeat. "Surface, pull me up," I screamed, my voice panicked. The winch on the surface started pulling me up. But the creature followed, gliding effortlessly alongside me. Its hollow gaze never left me, and as I ascended, it reached out again, this time brushing against my helmet. A sharp, blinding pain shot through my head. My ears filled with the sound of rushing water, and those same whispering voices echoed in my mind. The last thing I remember before I blacked out was the creature's face, inhuman, ancient, and full of malice. When I woke, I was on the boat, surrounded by the crew. Their faces were pale. "You were down there too long," the captain said, his voice grave. "Your oxygen was almost gone. What happened?" I tried to explain, but the words wouldn't come. My footage, corrupted, static. My suit's temperature sensors malfunctioned, recording freezing temperatures. The wreck was immediately marked off limits after that. I tried to move on, but the dreams wouldn't stop. In them, I'm back in the wreck, surrounded by the glowing carvings and the creatures there, watching, waiting. But it wasn't a deep-sea monster. It was a great white shark, massive, with glowing eyes, bigger than anything I've ever seen. Something not of this world. The worst part is that something is down there, waiting. And I'm not about to test its patience again. I don't dive anymore. Whatever's in those depths, it doesn't want to be disturbed. I've worked in the county morgue for over a decade. The dead don't scare me. They never have. To me, they're just bodies, lifeless vessels that have already given up whatever they once were. Sure, there's the occasional case with a gruesome story behind it, but in the end, they're just husks. They don't bother me, and I don't bother them. Simple as that. But one night I learned the dead aren't always silent. It was a quiet shift, nothing out of the ordinary. I was sitting at my desk, catching up on paperwork, trying to ignore the unsettling silence that always seems to hang over this place. The building's old, built decades ago, and it always has this weird, creaky vibe to it. The kind of place where even the floorboards seem to sigh when you walk. I've learned to tune it out over the years. Then the call came in, a John Doe found in an alley downtown. No ID, no witnesses, nothing. The EMTs couldn't figure out the cause of death, so they sent him over to me. They said it was odd. But of course, everything about the job is odd, so I didn't think much of it. When the body arrived, I immediately noticed two things. First, the man's face was frozen in an expression of pure terror, like he'd seen something in his last moments that made him wish he'd never been born. I've seen some dead faces, sure, but this one was different. It was almost too real, like the fear was still there, lingering. Second, his skin was freezing cold. Now, I know it's normal for a body to lose heat after death, but this was different. This wasn't the usual chill of death settling in. This felt unnatural, like it was coming from inside the man. I rolled the gurney into the autopsy room, trying to push aside that creeping sense of unease gnawing at the back of my mind. I set the body on the table and started preparing my tools. The lights flickered. I froze. The lights flicker all the time in this old building. It's one of those things you just get used to. But tonight, it felt different. And then I heard it, a whisper. So faint, I thought I imagined it. "Help me!" I stopped mid-motion, scalpel in hand, and just stared at the body on the table. I couldn't see anything. The room was empty, except for me and the dead man. I took a deep breath. "Okay, it's fine," I told myself. "It's just the old wiring. Just nerves, that's all." I resumed setting up for the incision, trying to shake off the feeling that I was being watched. Then it came again, louder this time, more insistent. "Help me!" My hands went clammy, my heart rate spiking. I looked down at the body, but it was still, dead. Nothing had changed. But I swear I could feel something in the air. The temperature dropped. A coldness I couldn't explain seeped into my bones. My breath fogged up the air in front of me, and the footsteps, those footsteps echoed in my ears, though the room was empty. I stepped back from the table, my hands shaking now, pulse racing. I was about to ask myself if I was going insane, but then it happened. The body sat up, slowly. Its head jerked toward me, and its eyes, wide and bloodshot, locked onto mine. "Don't let them take me," it rasped. The voice wasn't just his, it was layered, like multiple people were speaking at once, all trapped inside that one mangled body. I stumbled back, crashing into the tray of tools, making a noise that probably sounded like a cat on a chalkboard. "You're dead!" I shouted, my voice cracking. "This isn't possible!" The man's mouth opened, as if to scream, but nothing came out. No sound, just the faintest gurgling, like the air was being forced through a closed throat. And then, as quickly as it had sat up, the body convulsed violently, like something was jerking it from the inside. And just as suddenly it collapsed back onto the table, lifeless once more. I stood there for what felt like hours, my legs frozen in place, my brain not quite processing what had just happened. It wasn't just the body, it was something else, something other. My pulse thudded in my ears, and I realized I hadn't breathed in what felt like an eternity. Eventually, I found the willpower to check the security footage. I've watched enough bizarre things happen here over the years to know that the cameras don't always catch everything. But this, the footage just showed me, screaming at an empty table, pointing at the corpse like I was insane. The body didn't move. It was still, perfectly still. I was the crazy one, apparently. I never went back to that morgue. It's not the dead that scare me. It's what else might be lurking in the dark corners of this place. Whatever I encountered that night wasn't just dead. It was something else entirely. And I've never quite figured out what it wanted. I work at a small distribution warehouse in Wilmington, Delaware. And most days it's just the usual. Sorting, packing, and shipping goods. The kind of place where you don't expect anything strange to happen. But there's this one part of the warehouse that I've always avoided. The old storage room in the back. Something about it feels off, like a weight in the air that I can't shake. It's colder there than the rest of the building, no matter the season. The kind of cold that settles deep in your bones. I try not to go back there if I can help it, but sometimes I don't get a choice. One evening, the boss asked me to retrieve a batch of boxes from the storage room. I grabbed the keys from the wall, feeling the weight of them in my hand. As I made my way down the long hallway, my footsteps echoed off the concrete walls, too loud in the silence. When I reached the door, I unlocked it, and the blast of cold air that hit me almost knocked me back. It felt wrong, too cold, like the air itself had been waiting for me. The lights flickered overhead and I stepped inside. It was as if the temperature dropped even further once I crossed the threshold. I felt this unease crawling up my spine, but I couldn't place why. Maybe it was the flickering lights or the heavy silence, but I had the sense that something wasn't right. The boxes were stacked high, some of them labeled with the usual company logo. I grabbed the first one, expecting it to be filled with more supplies or equipment. But when I tried to lift it, it was heavier than I expected. Too heavy. I set it back down and noticed something strange. The box was sealed shut, like completely sealed. No tape on the edges, just a perfect, smooth finish, as though it had never been opened. Curiosity got the better of me, and I pried it open with my hands, the cardboard creaking as I pulled it apart. What I found inside was not what I had imagined. A mannequin. Not the kind of mannequin you'd see in a store display, but an old, lifelike one, dressed in what looked like clothes from the 80s, with a face that was disturbingly realistic. Its eyes were wide open, staring right at me. For a second, I just stood there, frozen. It felt like it was looking into me, not just at me. My heart was pounding now, and I stepped back slowly, trying to gather myself. I looked around, and there were more boxes stacked up behind it. One by one, I opened them. Each box contained another mannequin. Each one was more unsettling than the last. The faces were all slightly different, but they all had that same lifelike, wide-eyed stare. Some had cracks in their faces, others looked like they were freshly made, and I couldn't help but wonder how long they had been there. That's when I heard it. The door behind me slammed shut. I whipped around, my breath catching in my throat. The door wasn't supposed to close by itself. It was heavy, and it had a latch that was tricky to work. I rushed to it, my hands fumbling at the handle, but it wouldn't open. It felt like something was holding it shut. And then I heard it, a low, raspy whisper. It was coming from behind me, from the mannequins. "Stay with us." I don't know how to explain it, but the air in that room felt thick, like I was being suffocated. My panic shot through the roof as I turned, and that's when I saw them, the mannequins. They were moving. Slowly at first, like they were waking up from a deep sleep. Their limbs twitched, their heads began to turn, and those wide, glassy eyes followed me. They were alive, or at least, something was making them move. My heart raced as I struggled with the door, but it wouldn't budge. I could hear their feet scraping across the floor, one after the other, and I thought I was going to lose it. Finally, I managed to get the door open just enough to slip through. I didn't even look back as I ran down the hallway, my mind screaming, my feet pounding against the cold floor. I didn't stop until I was out of that building, the door slamming shut behind me. I don't know who put those mannequins in that storage room or why they were there, but I'm not going back. I'll never go near that room again. And if I ever see those eyes staring at me again, I'll run the other way, fast. I work as a security guard at a facility in Hartford, Connecticut, a job that's about as exciting as it sounds. Most nights I sit at a desk, sip coffee, and watch the security monitors while the occasional rat scurries across the parking lot. It's a quiet, routine gig, but then there was that one night, the night everything changed. It started like every other shift, quiet, uneventful. I grabbed my rounds list, checked the monitors, and began my patrol. The building was eerily silent, save for the hum of the air conditioning and the occasional flicker of the fluorescent lights. I've worked here long enough to know the layout by heart, and the East Wing, always the worst part of my rounds, was as creepy as ever. A narrow, dimly lit corridor leading to the storage area, it's always felt off. The air there is thicker, as if you're being watched. It has a way of making your skin crawl, even though you know no one's around. That night, though, the air felt colder than usual, not just from the AC, but a deep, unnatural chill that made my breath fog up. Despite it being late summer, the temperature dropped drastically. I pulled my jacket tighter, unease gnawing at the edges of my mind. The hallway ahead was lit only by emergency lights, casting jagged shadows on the walls. My footsteps echoed louder than usual, amplifying the silence. I tried to shake off the feeling, convincing myself it was just the old building shifting. As I passed the usual offices and storage rooms, I reached the East Wing. The storage room at the end of the hall had always given me the creeps, but tonight something felt different. I heard it, a soft thud, like something falling. I stopped, hand hovering over the door handle. It could have been nothing, just the building settling, but I couldn't ignore the growing instinct to check. I opened the door. Immediately, I was hit with a blast of cold air, sharp and biting like stepping into a freezer. The light from my flashlight barely cut through the gloom. The room was just like I remembered, filled with old office furniture, crates, and boxes stacked in the corner. But something caught my eye. An office chair, sitting near a stack of boxes, was slowly rocking back and forth. It looked as though someone had just gotten up from it. But the room was empty. I stared at it, trying to rationalize it. Maybe the floor was uneven, or the AC was causing the chair to move. But no, the more I looked, the more I felt that something wasn't right. My pulse quickened. I stepped closer. The chair stopped moving, abruptly, like it was aware of my presence. I shook my head, trying to dismiss the uneasy feeling that was creeping up on me. It was just a chair, nothing more. But then I heard it, a whisper. Barely audible, but unmistakable. Jean. My stomach dropped. I froze, spinning around, flashlight in hand, scanning the room. Nothing. The room was just as empty as it had been before. I told myself it was nothing, just the building making noise. But then I heard it again, clearer this time, almost urgent. Stay! The air around me thickened, suffocating. My heart began to pound, my chest tightening. I gripped the flashlight harder, but it felt like the light was fading, like it wasn't enough. I tried to convince myself it was just an old building, drafts, creaks, pipes rattling. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. There was something wrong, something in the room with me. And then the door slammed shut behind me. Bam! I nearly jumped out of my skin, my breath caught in my throat. My hand scrambled for the door handle, but it wouldn't budge. The latch was stuck, like something or someone was holding it shut. My flashlight flickered, casting strange jerky shadows. I pulled harder, but the door wouldn't open. And then, the voice again. Louder, more insistent. Stay with us. I wasn't thinking clearly anymore. Panic surged through me, and all I could think about was getting out. I yanked at the door, pulling with all my strength. It finally clicked open, and I sprinted down the hallway, not daring to look back. My heart was hammering, my legs trembling beneath me as I reached the security desk. I slammed the door behind me and locked it, leaning against the desk, trying to catch my breath. I glanced at the security monitors. The East Wing camera was showing the storage room. The door was wide open, and standing just inside was a figure, tall, thin, shadowy, featureless. I blinked. The figure was gone. The camera feed flickered back to normal, showing an empty room. But I knew what I saw. Whatever had been in that room, whatever had caused that voice, it wasn't gone. It was still there, somewhere. I didn't finish my shift. I grabbed my jacket, clocked out, and left. I haven't been back to the East Wing since. The door might be locked, but I'll never go near that room again. The last thing I remember was walking past the East Wing, the cold air following me, but I didn't dare turn around. As we close these stories of workplace horrors, let them be a warning. The most terrifying dangers often come from what we choose to overlook. The strange noise, the flicker of movement in the shadows, the unease we brush aside. They're not always harmless. Sometimes they're signs of something darker waiting to surface. Work is where we spend most of our lives, a place we consider safe and predictable. But safety can breed complacency, and the familiar can hide the unimaginable. These tales remind us to question the ordinary, to stay alert even in the most routine moments. Trust your instincts and don't dismiss what feels off. It might just save you. The next time you clock in, take a moment to look around. Pay attention to what's lurking in the shadows or waiting in the quiet corners. If these stories left you looking over your shoulder, hit subscribe to Husborn Horrors, because the next nightmare might be closer than you think. Stay safe and stay aware.